He was face down on the pavement, wrists bound tight behind his back, while the officer hovered above him, one hand on his holster and the other gripping a radio, barking codes like they meant something. That's how it started, for them. For him, it started long before. In a city where silence is safer than dignity, a black man in a clean shirt, reading a book alone in a park, was enough to make someone reach for handcuffs. There was no struggle, no crime, just presence. And that apparently was too much. But here's what they didn't know. The man they thought they could humiliate was the one person in the city with the authority to dismantle everything they believed they controlled. This is not a story about revenge. It's a story about exposure, about what happens when prejudice plays itself into the hands of someone who's been watching the system from the inside, waiting, listening, calculating. You're about to witness a chain reaction set off by one reckless decision, an arrest rooted in nothing but bias, and a man who never raised his voice, yet turned an entire department upside down. Before we dive in, hit that like button if you're here for stories that don't just entertain but confront reality. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when power underestimates quiet strength. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from and what you would have thought if you saw a black man calmly reading in the park, only to see him dragged away in cuffs. Let's begin. The sun had only just begun to rise over Arlington Park, its early morning light trickling through the gently swaying branches of oak and sycamore trees. Golden beams danced across the dew-covered grass like quiet whispers, and the rhythmic chirping of sparrows echoed across the open field. The city, only a few blocks away, remained muted, its noise not yet spilling into this tranquil sanctuary. In the far corner of the park, just beyond the statue of the Revolutionary soldier, a solitary man sat on a weather-worn bench, unbothered, unhurried, and unreadable. Thaddeus Monroe, dressed in a crisp linen shirt and dark slacks, his polished brown shoes dusted lightly with the remnants of the gravel path, turned a page of the book resting on his lap. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. A philosophical giant's quiet musings in the hands of a man who carried the same silent weight. His fingers, long and steady, traced the page for a moment before letting it fall naturally to the next. His eyes, deep set under neatly trimmed brows, scanned each line with deliberate calm. He wasn't reading for escape. He was reading for reinforcement. Every morning, like clockwork, Thaddeus came to this bench at precisely 7 a.m. He would take the same path, nod at the same elderly man walking his collie, and settle into the same spot beneath the same rusted lamppost that hadn't worked in at least 5 years. A small thermos of green tea sat beside him on the bench, untouched but still warm. The light breeze stirred the corners of his book and brushed against the collar of his shirt. If someone had been watching, they might have thought he was simply a man with too much time and too few worries. But they would have been wrong. The stillness of the morning wasn't just a comfort to Thaddeus. It was necessary. It was in these quiet moments that he recalibrated himself. The demands of his position, the weight of the choices he often had to make, and the silence he maintained about who he really was, all of it found a sort of equilibrium here in the park. He could sit, think, and be just another man. No expectations, no protocols, no eyes scrutinizing his every word for hidden meaning. Just birds, trees, and books. The cover of Meditations was worn, its corners slightly curled, the pages peppered with annotations in precise black ink. Beside a particularly sharp passage, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Thaddeus had scribbled, still true. Especially now. He didn't smile at the thought, but his shoulders relaxed slightly as he stared out toward the field, where 2 early joggers were weaving between the trail markers. One of them gave him a small nod as they passed. He returned it with a subtle lift of his hand. A blue jay swooped down onto a nearby bench, cocking its head curiously before hopping twice and flying off again. The tranquility was palpable, a sort of ambient stillness that refused to be rushed. The kind of morning poets wrote about and painters tried to capture. And Thaddeus was part of it, not above it or outside it. A man with a book, a bench, and peace. The contrast to what he had left behind, indeed, was sharp. His office there, windowless and thick, with a scent of old carpet and freshly printed intelligence briefs, was a world built on tension. Decisions were made in half-light, truths whispered, lies managed. There, Thaddeus was not just a man. He was a mechanism, a tool of oversight, an arbiter between justice and its enforcement. But here he was someone else, not hiding, just resting. As time passed, the park slowly began to stir. A woman on a bench across the path opened a novel and pulled her hoodie tight against the breeze. A groundskeeper swept leaves into neat piles, humming something tuneless but strangely comforting. The world was waking, and with it, the illusion that this calm could stretch on indefinitely. But for now, Thaddeus allowed himself the delusion. He reached down, unscrewed the cap from his thermos, and took a sip of the now lukewarm tea. His eyes closed briefly, savoring the bitter clarity of it. When they opened again, he turned another page. He had no idea what would happen within the hour. No sense of the confrontation approaching like a slow-moving train around a bend. For now, the book, the bench, and the birds were enough. He adjusted the angle of his legs, crossing them at the ankle, and rested the book spine down on his thigh for a moment. In the distance, the faint blare of a siren could be heard, far enough to ignore, but near enough to be noted. Thaddeus looked toward the street that bordered the east side of the park. Nothing yet. He exhaled, deep and slow, and picked the book back up. Another page turned. Another thought planted in the foundation of his mind. In the world of chaos he often navigated, clarity was currency. And right now he was wealthy. He didn't know the name Garrett Blaine yet. Didn't know the officer's history of disciplinary warnings, or his growing resentment toward a city changing faster than his worldview could keep up. He didn't know about the vague report that had come across dispatch 10 minutes ago about a suspicious individual in Riverside Park. Nor did he know that his face, serene, thoughtful, and still, would be interpreted as a threat in just a few more minutes. Right now, the only thing Thaddeus Monroe knew was the silence, and he cherished it. Deputy Garrett Blaine adjusted the strap of his duty belt as he stepped out of his cruiser, the soles of his boots crunching over a patch of gravel near the park's east entrance. The morning air was sharp, laced with the earthy scent of mown grass and the faint tang of distant car exhaust. A slow patrol through Arlington Park had never been his favorite assignment, too quiet, too soft. But ever since the precinct restructured its routes, he had drawn this area twice a week. He preferred downtown shifts, where the lines between threat and order were clearer. Here, surrounded by joggers, dog walkers, and benches named after dead donors, he felt unanchored. His eyes scanned the winding paths with the measured boredom of a man waiting for something to justify his presence. His fingers tapped absent-mindedly against his baton, and his mind wandered until it landed on the vague bolo that had come over dispatch 20 minutes earlier. Unknown individual, male, possible narcotics activity, reported loitering in the east quarter of Arlington Park. No visual description. It was flimsy, unverified, and smelled of neighborly paranoia. But for Garrett, it was a reason to dig. He turned a corner near the old war memorial, where the trees parted and the main walking trail opened wide into the grassy commons. That's when he saw him, alone on the bench, book in hand, still a stone. Garrett slowed his pace slightly, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his patrol cap. The man didn't look like someone just passing through. No phone, no earbuds, no signs of morning hustle. Just sitting there with a hardback book like he had nowhere to be. In Garrett's mind, that was enough to raise questions. People didn't come here to be still. They moved. They jogged. They posted selfies with coffee in hand. But this guy, something about him felt off. Too composed. Too self-contained. The deputy tilted his head as he watched from a distance. The man's shirt was clean, tucked in, collar ironed. The shoes polished. Not brand new, but cared for. He looked like he belonged in an office, somewhere, not on a public bench reading ancient philosophy. Garrett felt his gut tighten, a sensation he had learned long ago to trust without question. He didn't like things that didn't fit into neat categories. And right now, The man on the bench didn't fit. He put a name to the unease almost instinctively. Maybe he was casing the area. Maybe he was a lookout. Maybe he was one of those smart guys, the kind who wore their quiet like armor but always had an angle. He reached for his shoulder mic but hesitated. No crime. No confrontation. Not yet. Just observation. Garrett shifted his stance and adjusted the bill of his cap to block the glare. The man turned a page, glanced up briefly at a passing jogger, and then went back to reading, unbothered. That subtle, almost dismissive calmness rubbed Garrett the wrong way. Most people stiffened when they felt his eyes on them. Most gave some kind of tell. But this guy didn't flinch, didn't twitch. It was like he knew he was being watched and just didn't care. Garrett muttered under his breath, too cool for his own good. He began walking slowly toward the bench, boots steady against the brick path, hand brushing the edge of his holster, not gripping, not threatening, but close enough to draw if needed. Every step he took tightened the narrative in his head. The man was too clean-cut to be aimless, too relaxed to be naive, too unreadable to be harmless. He had the look of someone who knew the rules well enough to bend them, the type who threw lawsuits instead of punches. Garrett had dealt with those before, self-important men with degrees and clipped tones who acted like badges were beneath them. As he approached, he rehearsed the opening lines in his head. Morning. Everything all right? Just need to ask a few questions. Harmless enough. Open-ended. But he already knew it wouldn't stay friendly. Something about the way the man held his book, with fingers that moved like he wasn't in a rush, irritated him. That posture didn't say visitor. It said occupier. Garrett didn't like that. Not here. Not in his park. He paused about 20 feet away, watching. The man glanced up again, just briefly, but this time their eyes met. The look was not confrontational, not challenging, but direct. It held neither fear nor submission. Garrett's jaw flexed. He hated that kind of look. The kind that said, I know how this goes, and I'm not impressed. No sudden movements. No panic. Just a slow bookmark placed between pages, a deliberate fold of the corner, and a return to stillness. Garrett blinked. He felt like he was being studied, and not in a good way. For a moment, he hesitated. Maybe he should walk on. Let it go. But that thought was crushed instantly by his own pride. If he let it slide now, the unease would stay with him all day. And besides, if he ignored what might be a lead, Internal would have a field day if something actually happened later. Garrett's boots struck the ground in a deliberate rhythm as he closed the remaining distance between himself and the man on the bench. Each step felt like an affirmation of control, of presence. He wasn't going to start with force, that would come later if needed, but he would start with posture, with tone, with questions that felt like conversation but were meant to press down, to test. He stopped 3 feet from the bench, casting a long shadow across the pages of the man's book. Morning, Garrett said, voice level but edged with that subtle tightness that came when he already didn't like the answer he hadn't received yet. Thaddeus looked up slowly, eyes calm, unreadable, and closed the book with care, one finger keeping his place. Morning, he returned, not cold, not warm, just neutral. Garrett tilted his head, giving the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. That's a heavy read for a park bench, he said, gesturing toward the closed book. Marcus Aurelius, huh? Didn't think we had too many Stoics hanging around Arlington this time of day. Thaddeus glanced down at the cover as if confirming it, then back up, maintaining eye contact. A quiet place makes the philosophy stick better, he replied, voice calm, his southern cadence subtle but present. Garrett chuckled, too loud, too forced. Right, he said, adjusting his belt. I guess some folks find meaning in all kinds of things. There was an awkward pause. Garrett didn't move. Thaddeus didn't speak. The silence sat between them, heavy. Garrett broke it. You from around here? He asked, arms crossed now, feet planted shoulder width apart. Thaddeus didn't shift. Been around, he said simply, offering nothing more. That non-answer irritated Garrett more than it should have. It wasn't disrespectful, but it wasn't deferential either. It left too much room for Garrett to fill with his own assumptions. Garrett looked toward the treeline, then back at Thaddeus. We've had some break-ins recently. Cars. Mostly over by the tennis courts. You see anything suspicious?" His voice was still composed, but the underlying tone had shifted. Accusation draped in courtesy. Thaddeus shook his head once. "Just squirrels and early joggers," he said. Garrett smirked, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Yeah? No packages exchanged? No nervous pacing?" His voice dropped a notch. "Just peaceful reading, huh?" Thaddeus gave a small smile, one that didn't show teeth. "Just peaceful reading," he echoed. He opened the book slightly, not as a challenge, but as if signaling the conversation was nearing its natural end. Garrett hated that. He hated when people decided when conversations with him ended. "You come here often?" he asked. His voice now clipped, the cadence tightening like a noose. "Once in a while," Thaddeus said, not looking up this time. Garrett's jaw flexed. "See, thing is," he said, voice dropping further, "I walk this beat all the time. Never seen you before. Funny how people just show up when there's trouble in the area." He let the statement hang in the air, a challenge dressed like a comment. Thaddeus looked up again, closed the book entirely, and placed it on his lap. "You're saying I look like trouble, officer?" Garrett blinked. The directness had thrown him off, but only for a second. "No," he said, smile returning but harder now. "I'm saying I like to know who's spending time in my park." Thaddeus studied him, then nodded slowly. "Your park," he repeated, not with sarcasm, but something else, understanding maybe. "I didn't see your name on the bench." Garrett stepped forward, half a pace. "Look," he said, voice sharpening, "I'm just trying to keep the area safe. You can understand that, right?" Thaddeus didn't move. "Perfectly," he said, calm but firmer. "So what's unsafe about me reading a book?" Garrett didn't answer right away. He looked down at the cover again, worn but cared for, then at the man's clean clothes, polished shoes, still posture. It all irritated him more than a loiterer shouting obscenities ever could. "I don't know," Garrett said finally, leaning in slightly. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Thaddeus exhaled slowly, the first visible sign of tension. Not anger, restraint. "Is there something you'd like to ask directly, officer?" he said. Garrett's hand twitched near his radio. He didn't like being put in a position where he was the one who had to explain himself. "Let's start with some ID," he said, stepping back a little, but keeping his body square. "Just a formality, if you've got nothing to hide." Thaddeus stared at him for a long second, then another. The wind shifted slightly through the trees behind them, sending a few yellow leaves tumbling onto the path. "Am I being detained?" he asked, voice flat. Garrett's nostrils flared. "You will be if you don't cooperate," he said. Garrett's stance hardened as the words left Thaddeus' mouth, the question echoing between them like a challenge more dangerous than a raised voice. "Am I being detained?" The kind of line Garrett had heard from YouTube lawyers and protesters who memorized constitutional clauses but never understood the real world. He shifted his weight forward, the leather of his duty belt creaking faintly as he squared off with the man on the bench. "Look," he said, his voice colder now, "I'm giving you a chance to make this easy. I asked for ID. It's not a big deal unless you make it one." Thaddeus didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "Respectfully, officer, I'm sitting in a public park reading a book. You haven't cited any reasonable suspicion of a crime. If I'm free to go, then I'll choose to stay right here and keep reading." He gestured slightly to the meditations still on his lap, then folded his hands on top of it with practice calm. That kind of clarity, measured, unshaken, made Garrett bristle. It wasn't just the refusal, it was the control behind it. This wasn't how people usually reacted when he stepped in close. Most either panicked or complied. But this one held the line, and that unnerved him in a way he didn't want to admit. Garrett's voice lowered, just above a growl. "You're not giving me a lot of options here, sir." He emphasized the "sir" like a blade dipped in sarcasm. Thaddeus met his stare evenly. "I believe you're the one with the choices here, officer," he said, each word deliberate. "You can escalate this, or you can explain your suspicion clearly." That word, escalate, rang in Garrett's ears like an alarm. It was the language of complaints, of reviews, of body cams being pulled by internal affairs. His jaw clenched, and his hand drifted just a fraction closer to his holster. not touching it, just reminding the space between them who had the badge. "Don't play games with me," Garrett said, stepping closer now, close enough that his boots brushed the edge of Thaddeus' bench. "I asked for ID, and you're refusing. That alone is grounds for detainment if I believe you're obstructing an investigation." Thaddeus tilted his head slightly, his voice still calm but edged with warning. "What investigation? There's been no report, no victim, no evidence of a crime. You approached me, not the other way around." Garrett felt heat rise to his face, but he forced it down, tried to reset the tone. "Look, man, I get it," he said, lowering his volume. "You're one of those types, knows your rights, wants to make a point. But this could be over in 30 seconds if you just hand me your ID. That's all I'm asking." Thaddeus didn't respond right away. He sat in silence, eyes locked on Garrett's, weighing the moment like a chess move. Then, finally, he said, "And if I don't?" Garrett straightened, his posture shifting into one of command. "Then I'll have to assume you're being deliberately evasive, and I'll proceed accordingly." Thaddeus' lips pressed into a thin line. He knew what that meant. It was the moment just before everything changed, when silence could still stop a storm, but just barely. Still, Thaddeus remained unmoved. "I've given you no cause," he said. "I'm not obligated to present ID without probable cause. That's the law." Garrett's fist tightened at his side. His mind raced, not with legal rationale, but with anger. Not because he was being challenged on policy, but because every second that ticked by in silence made him feel smaller, lesser, out of control. And Garrett hated that more than anything. He hated that this man's calm made him feel reckless, that this quiet defiance made him question whether he was in control, or whether he'd already lost it. He stepped back half a foot, then reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7-3, he said, eyes still locked on Thaddeus. "I've got a potential 10 to 29. Requesting backup unit to Arlington Park East. Possible obstruction." His voice was clipped, clinical. Thaddeus exhaled slowly, his gaze never wavering. "So this is where we're going?" he asked, almost more to himself than Garrett. The officer didn't answer. The line had been drawn. The moment was already set in motion. Thaddeus reached into his jacket pocket slowly, no sudden movements, and pulled out his wallet. He opened it, extracted a simple leather ID holder, and extended it toward Garrett with a neutral hand. Garrett snatched it quicker than necessary, flipping it open like a predator catching prey. His eyes scanned the name, Thaddeus Monroe. No middle name, no criminal flags, local address, nothing remarkable. He stared at it for a second longer than needed, hoping something would leap out at him. But it didn't. It was clean. "Stand up," Garrett said sharply, not even handing the ID back. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Thaddeus looked up calmly. "You're arresting me?" "You're being detained for failing to comply," Garrett barked. "We'll sort it out at the station." No more questions. No more calm. The handcuffs clicked shut with a finality that seemed to echo across the otherwise quiet park. Thaddeus offered no resistance, his hands resting behind his back with a stillness that was almost defiant in its composure. Garrett, tightening the cuffs with more force than necessary, muttered under his breath, "You match the description. That's all I need." The lie hung in the air like smog, thin, toxic, and immediately recognizable. Thaddeus didn't respond. He simply looked forward, eyes focused on nothing, breathing even, posture unbroken. Garrett gripped his arm and began leading him away from the bench. The meditations book remained behind, abandoned on the stone slab, like evidence of something Garrett couldn't name, but had already dismissed. A couple walking their golden retriever paused on the path nearby. The woman frowned, watching as Thaddeus, well-dressed and visibly unthreatening, was marched away in cuffs. "Excuse me, officer," she called hesitantly. "What's he done?" Garrett didn't even turn. "Official police business. Keep walking." The tone was enough to silence her, but not the unease in her eyes. She watched as they passed, then pulled out her phone, beginning to record from a distance. Behind them, another man, mid-30s, hoodie, earbuds around his neck, stepped off the path and stood still. "Yo," he said loudly, pulling out his phone too. "You serious right now?" That man wasn't doing nothing. Garrett stiffened but didn't answer. He hated when civilians started filming. It always turned simple detainments into PR disasters. "Sir, step back," he snapped, now dragging Thaddeus faster toward the cruiser parked at the curb outside the park's entrance. The pressure of the cuffs bit into Thaddeus' wrists, but he remained silent, his head high. He scanned the area, not in panic, but in quiet calculation. A few more heads had turned. One jogger slowed to a stop. Someone across the field raised their phone to take a photo. This moment, which could have easily faded into obscurity, was now frozen in the lens of strangers and, soon enough, in the cloud. As they reached the vehicle, Garrett opened the back door with one hand and guided Thaddeus down with the other. "Watch your head," he said with none of the usual courtesy. Thaddeus slid in, his knees grazing the hard vinyl seat. The car door slammed shut with a metallic finality. Garrett took a breath, tried to steady his nerves, and looked around quickly to see who was still filming. Two bystanders across the street, another on the sidewalk. He pretended not to see them, walked around to the driver's seat, and climbed in. The cruiser's engine hummed to life, and Garrett adjusted his rear-view mirror to get a look at his passenger. Thaddeus sat still, hands behind him, looking out the window with an unreadable expression. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. Garrett hated that more than yelling. Silence like that was judgment, and worse, confidence. As they pulled away from the park, Garrett tapped his radio. "Unit 7 to 3 en route with one detained. Black male, mid-40s, matches subject description. Will advise on further once at station." The lie came out smoother the second time. It always did. Inside the cruiser, the city began to pass in a blur. Side streets, storefronts, intersections. Garrett gripped the steering wheel tighter than he needed to. The silence in the back seat filled the space between them, making the cabin feel smaller, heavier. Finally, Garrett broke it. "So what were you really doing in that park, huh?" he asked, eyes fixed on the road. "Waiting on someone? Watching for something?" Thaddeus turned his head slowly, met his gaze in the mirror. "Reading," he said. "Like I told you." Garrett scoffed. "Right. Because guys like you spend their mornings with philosophy in public parks." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow. "Guys like me," he said evenly. Garrett faltered, realizing his words too late, but refusing to back down. "You don't look like someone who reads that kind of stuff," he said. "That's all I'm saying." Thaddeus nodded once, more to himself than to Garrett. "And what exactly do I look like?" he asked. Garrett didn't respond. The air between them tightened again, thick with unspoken truths neither one would admit aloud. As they turned onto the main boulevard that led toward the precinct, a familiar low-level dread began to crawl up Garrett's spine. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the calm in Thaddeus' voice. Maybe it was the stares from strangers. Or maybe it was the subtle way this man hadn't once begged, shouted, or tried to explain himself. Most people pleaded when the cuffs clicked on. This one simply watched. Garrett had seen that look before, but never from someone without a badge of their own. He shook the thought away as the precinct came into view. Brick and glass, standard city fare. He pulled into the lot, parked in the intake lane, and stepped out quickly, opening the rear door. "Let's go," he said. Thaddeus stepped out without hesitation, still silent, still composed. They walked toward the intake doors. Garrett could feel eyes on him already. Fellow officers outside smoking, desk clerks behind the glass. Some raised eyebrows. Others didn't react. Garrett led Thaddeus through the precinct's intake hallway with deliberate steps, ensuring that every uniformed officer and passing clerk saw the man in cuffs. He wanted them to look. He wanted them to assume. As they walked under the harsh fluorescent lighting, Garrett's grip on Thaddeus' arm remained firm, not violent, but dominant, performative. The kind of grip meant not for control, but for show. Two officers at the report desk looked up as they passed. One raised an eyebrow, the other gave a low whistle and muttered. Another one? Huh? Garrett didn't respond, but his smirk spoke for him. Thaddeus, in contrast, said nothing, his eyes sweeping over the precinct with quiet focus, as though cataloging every corner, every nameplate, every face that turned to watch. The processing officer behind the desk, a young woman named Jenkins, leaned over to Garrett as they arrived. "Charge," she asked flatly, fingers poised over the keyboard. Garrett hesitated for half a beat. "Suspicious behavior. Possible obstruction," he said, then slid Thaddeus' ID across the counter without looking at it. Jenkins picked it up and glanced at the name, then at Thaddeus, then back to Garrett with a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "You sure?" she asked, voice low. Garrett nodded stiffly, irritation already rising. "Just process him. I'll file the incident report after I grab coffee." Jenkins opened her mouth to say something else, but Garrett had already turned away, leaving Thaddeus standing silently in front of the desk. Thaddeus remained quiet as Jenkins began entering data into the system. His hands were still cuffed behind him. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't ask questions. Even as the processing area filled with the low murmur of background noise, phones ringing, radios crackling, printers churning, he stood like a statue. It unnerved Jenkins more than she cared to admit. Most detainees were either defiant or scared. This one seemed above it. She handed off the paperwork to another officer, a grizzled sergeant with a clipboard who wordlessly led Thaddeus toward holding. The holding area was dimmer, colder, its concrete benches stained from years of wear. Thaddeus was guided inside and seated on the far end of a row, still cuffed, still unreadable. The sergeant locked the door and walked away without a word. Time passed without measure. There was no clock, just the echo of boots in the hallway and the soft buzz of overhead lights. No one came. No one spoke. The minutes stretched into an hour. Then another. Thaddeus sat with his back straight, his eyes forward. He didn't lean against the wall. He didn't slump. He simply existed, silently bearing the weight of every assumption cast upon him the moment Garrett decided his presence in the park was a threat. Outside the cell, Garrett had returned to the intake desk with a steaming cup of coffee and a sense of righteous accomplishment. He leaned against the counter, chatting idly with another officer about the park eye, tossing in just enough coded language to inflate the incident without outright lying. You could tell he thought he was smarter than everyone. Real smug. Probably a lawyer or something. One of those types. The officer laughed, and Garrett felt a small surge of satisfaction course through him. But that satisfaction was short-lived. The side door near the supervisor's office swung open, and a tall woman in a pressed white shirt and polished boots entered the intake area. Captain Dana Huxley, head of internal review and one of the highest-ranking officers in the division, stepped into the room with clipped heels and sharper eyes. She carried a manila folder under one arm and scanned the room as she approached the desk. Jenkins stood a little straighter. Garrett turned slowly, then quickly put on a professional posture. "Captain," he said with a nod. Huxley didn't return the greeting. Instead, she glanced at the screen behind Jenkins. Her eyes locked on the name, Thaddeus Monroe. For a split second, her brows lifted, only slightly, but Garrett caught it. "Why is this man in holding?" Huxley asked, her voice low and direct. Garrett opened his mouth, but Jenkins beat him to it. He was brought in earlier by Deputy Blaine, claimed he was obstructing during questioning in the park. Huxley turned to Garrett now, her gaze sharp. "And you verified this obstruction?" Garrett shifted. He refused to show ID, matched a vague description from earlier dispatch. Huxley stared at him for a moment, then turned back to Jenkins. "Pull up his file." Jenkins clicked through the system, and after a few seconds, the full dossier opened on screen. Huxley leaned in, scanned the data, and then slowly turned back to Garrett. "Do you know who you're holding?" she asked quietly, dangerously. Garrett frowned. "No, ma'am." He didn't say anything. Huxley stepped closer. "That man is Assistant Director Thaddeus Monroe of the Federal Office of Internal Oversight. The man you just processed is responsible for auditing police misconduct across 5 states. Garrett's face drained of color. "What?" he breathed. But Huxley wasn't finished. "He's here under a non-disclosed observation order. This precinct was already under review, and now you've handed him a front row seat." Garrett stood frozen in place, the weight of Captain Huxley's words crushing the illusion of authority he had so confidently worn all morning. His mouth hung slightly open as his mind struggled to catch up with the reality he had just walked into. Assistant Director, Federal Oversight, Observation Order. Each term thudded in his ears like a gavel pounding guilt into concrete. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust, and tried to form a sentence, but nothing coherent emerged. Captain Huxley didn't wait for him to speak. She turned toward the hallway that led to holding, her footsteps swift and unyielding. "Unlock holding cell 3, she barked at Jenkins, who was already rising from her chair, keys in hand. Garrett remained behind, rooted to the floor, staring at the manila folder now sitting ominously on the edge of the desk. His own name, he imagined, was likely mentioned somewhere in it by now, probably under a section labeled Incident Escalated Without Probable Cause or Abuse of Authority Under Color of Law. As Huxley reached the holding area, the electronic lock buzzed and the heavy door swung open. Thaddeus looked up, still seated upright on the concrete bench, his expression unchanged. If he was surprised to see her, he didn't show it. Huxley stepped in and gave a short nod, then motioned to the officer accompanying her. "Remove the cuffs." The sergeant stepped forward quickly, clearly briefed on what was happening, and unlocked the restraints. Thaddeus exhaled, slow and quiet, and rubbed his wrists, red from pressure, but otherwise unmarked. Huxley offered him a measured look. "Mr. Monroe, on behalf of this department, allow me to offer our deepest apology for the way this morning has unfolded." Thaddeus stood now, his posture still composed, but no longer passive. He didn't nod or thank her. He simply said, "I'd like to speak with your commanding officer in a closed room." "Now." Huxley nodded again, already turning. "This way." As they exited the holding corridor, the precinct fell into a kind of collective hush. Officers stepped aside instinctively, their eyes wide with the realization of who had just walked past them. Even those who hadn't been told outright could sense the seismic shift in power that had just occurred. Garrett stood by the desk as Thaddeus and Huxley approached, every muscle in his body stiff with dread. His instinct screamed at him to speak, to apologize, to explain himself, but no words came. Thaddeus didn't look at him. Not yet. He walked past, eyes forward, and entered the briefing room at the end of the hall without a sound. Huxley followed, closing the door behind them. Inside the room, the lighting was soft and the air stilled. A small conference table sat at the center, lined with outdated chairs and a whiteboard no one had used in years. Thaddeus remained standing. Huxley did as well. "I'll notify Chief Laramie immediately," she said, already pulling out her phone. "She's off-site this morning, but will be back within the hour." Thaddeus glanced at the badge on her chest. "Are you the ranking officer present?" "Yes," Huxley said. "Then we start with you," he replied calmly. "Sit down." She complied. Across the table, Thaddeus finally allowed a trace of steel into his voice. "You have a systemic issue in this precinct. I've seen enough already to validate the preliminary reports we've received. But what just occurred in that park, what happened from the moment Deputy Blaine approached me, is no longer just anecdotal. It's documented, it's actionable, and it's going to be addressed." Huxley's expression remained neutral, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her awareness of the storm she now had to manage. "Yes, sir. I understand." "Do you?" Thaddeus asked quietly. "Because that officer made decisions based entirely on my appearance. He did not ask about my presence before accusing. He lied on the report. He escalated without justification. He put his hands on me and paraded me through this facility like a trophy." Huxley nodded slowly. "Internal Affairs will begin a formal inquiry immediately." "This won't be handled by your Internal Affairs," Thaddeus said sharply. "This now falls under my office's jurisdiction." The silence that followed was thick and undeniable. Huxley's posture shifted slightly, her professional shell cracking just enough to expose the realization that this man could, with a single report, jeopardize half of her staff's careers. "We will cooperate fully," she said. "We'll make every record available. Body cams, dispatch logs, officer histories, all of it." "Good," Thaddeus said. He stood up straighter now, his voice leveling. "Because I'm not here as a victim. I'm here as a federal officer executing an evaluation of departmental integrity. And unfortunately for you, Officer Blaine just offered the most damning evidence I could have asked for." Within the hour, the briefing room that had once felt like a neglected corner of the precinct transformed into the epicenter of accountability. Word had spread with viral speed, through murmured conversations by the lockers, over stiff back posture in the report room, across hastily sent texts between officers trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. The man who had sat cuffed and silent in holding was now the highest-ranking figure in the building, not just by title, but by presence. When Chief Laramie finally arrived, flanked by 2 city legal advisors and her deputy chief, she entered the room with clipped steps and an expression carefully composed between respect and damage control. Thaddeus stood by the window, hands folded in front of him, not looking at anyone in particular, but commanding the space nonetheless. He didn't need to posture. He already owned the room. Chief Laramie extended a hand, which Thaddeus shook once, firmly. "Director Monroe," she said with practiced neutrality, "on behalf of this precinct and the city, I want to offer you a formal apology for what occurred this morning. Deputy Bland's conduct is unacceptable and does not reflect our department's values." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow slightly at that, but didn't challenge her. Yet, instead, he gestured to the chairs around the table. "Let's sit." They complied. Officers, who had outranked him in appearance just hours ago, now sat across from him like students waiting for a final grade they already feared. Huxley sat beside Laramie, her notepad open, pen poised, though she had yet to write a single word. Thaddeus waited until silence had fully settled before he spoke. His tone was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who was no longer extending benefit of the doubt. "This morning, I was detained in public without cause by an officer acting on impulse and assumption. That assumption, clearly, was rooted not in policy or evidence, but in bias." He paused and let the word hang. Across the table, no one moved. Even the legal advisors sat quietly, their legal pads blank, their pens untouched. "Let me be clear," Thaddeus continued. "I did not identify myself because my identity should not be required for me to be treated with dignity. I was not in disguise. I was not hiding. I was not acting with threat or suspicion. I was reading a book in a public park. That's all." His eyes landed on Huxley briefly, then Laramie. "And yet, I was handcuffed, walked through this building like a criminal, and locked in a cell, without ever being read my rights, without formal charges, without a shred of legitimate cause. That is not a mistake. That is a culture." Chief Laramie straightened. "We understand and no," Thaddeus cut in, voice still even. "You don't. Not yet. But you will." He opened a folder on the table that none of them had noticed in place earlier. Inside were several documents, including witness statements collected prior to today, anonymous officer complaints, disciplinary trends, and internal surveys, all pointing to a pattern within this department. "This precinct has been under preliminary review for 6 months, Thaddeus explained. Today was not an unfortunate coincidence. It was confirmation." Huxley's pen finally touched paper, but the sound was almost drowned out by the growing pressure in the room. Thaddeus slid the folder forward. "Effective immediately, my office is initiating a full-scale audit of this facility. Every shift log, every body cam file, every use of force report, every citizen complaint. Nothing will be exempt." Laramie's jaw tightened, but she didn't object. Thaddeus continued. "And that begins with Deputy Garrett Blaine. I want his entire personnel file. I want to know how many stops like this he's made, how many escalations, how many incidents were dismissed as misunderstandings. We'll provide everything," Huxley said quickly. "And Blaine?" Thaddeus asked, turning to Laramie now. "He's currently on administrative leave," she replied, "pending further review. He'll need to be interviewed under federal authority," Thaddeus said. "We'll coordinate with internal affairs, but the primary investigation will be handled by my team. This is no longer a local matter." Someone at the far end of the table shifted in their seat, the creak loud in the silence. Thaddeus let the moment hold, then added, "This is your opportunity to change the culture, before someone else forces you to. Laramie nodded once. "We'll cooperate fully." "Good," Thaddeus said, standing. "Because the next steps won't be just about discipline. They'll be about reform. If you want this precinct to survive the storm it's walking into, you're going to need more than apologies. You're going to need integrity." Garrett sat alone in the precinct locker room, his uniform shirt half unbuttoned, his badge lying face down on the bench beside him. The air felt heavier than usual, like it carried the weight of 100 unspoken judgments. Outside, the murmur of conversation floated down the corridor, hushed and deliberate, officers speaking in clipped tones that stopped the moment he passed. Less than 24 hours ago, he had strutted through these halls, throwing knowing glances and sarcastic comments without a second thought. Now every look was loaded, every silence was sharp. He had become the name no one wanted to say, but everyone whispered. The official order had arrived that morning. Administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a federal investigation. His access credentials were revoked, his patrol privileges stripped, and his weapon turned in. But the real damage didn't come from the paperwork. It came from the glances, the turned shoulders, and the quiet withdrawal of allies he once thought loyal. He scrolled through his phone mindlessly, but even that offered no escape. His name had already begun to surface on local forums. A blurry video from the park was making its rounds on social media, paired with a caption that read, "Man arrested for reading while black. Turns out he's federal." The comments below were split, some demanding reform, others defending his actions with fragile half-truths. Garrett read them all anyway. Each sentence felt like a nail. In the briefing room 2 floors up, Captain Huxley had begun meeting with federal liaisons assigned by Thaddeus Monroe's office. The audit process was already underway, files were being pulled, complaint logs reviewed, and Garrett's name appeared more than once in previous records, though never with consequences. Until now. The timing of Thaddeus's presence had felt random at first, but now, in retrospect, it seemed surgical. Every step Garrett had taken in that park, every word he had uttered with that falsely measured tone, had been recorded in Monroe's mind like a case file waiting to be built. He hadn't just arrested a man. He had handed evidence directly into the hands of the system's highest watchdog. Elsewhere in the city, the fallout had already begun to ripple. At a community center in North Arlington, a group of local residents gathered for an emergency forum. The mood was tense, the room filled with people of all ages, many of whom had experienced their own versions of what Thaddeus had endured, but without the title to shield them. One woman stood and addressed the room, her voice steady. "What happened to that man isn't just a fluke, it's a mirror. A mirror showing us how easy it is for dignity to be stripped with no cause and no apology." The applause that followed was long and genuine, not born of outrage alone, but of shared exhaustion. Meanwhile, Garrett was summoned to a private meeting with the department's legal liaison. The conversation was brief, sterile, and unmistakably final. "You are advised to retain independent counsel," the liaison said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "Federal investigators will be contacting you for a deposition. We recommend full cooperation." Garrett nodded, unable to muster a defense. He had tried to replay the events over and over, tried to find a version where his actions made sense, where he could justify them through protocol or urgency, but none held up. The truth kept creeping in, undeniable and ugly. He hadn't arrested a threat. He had arrested a man who made him uncomfortable. And now, that man was holding up a mirror to his entire career. At home that evening, Garrett sat on the edge of his living room couch, the TV on but muted, the screen flashing images of protests forming in front of the city's administrative building. Signs read, "Justice, not badges," and "We are not a threat." He recognized faces in the crowd, people he had passed by on his beat, people who had once nodded politely and moved out of his way. Now they stood firm, not in anger alone, but in clarity. The illusion of control he had clung to for so long had shattered, and in its place was a reality he could no longer ignore. The precinct, once a place of camaraderie and routine, now operated under the sharp lens of scrutiny. Officers were required to attend de-escalation training. Bias reviews were conducted. Body cam footage was audited weekly. And for the first time in years, silence no longer protected misconduct. Garrett's case had triggered more than embarrassment. It had sparked reform. A few officers who had remained silent during past misconduct came forward, filing formal statements about similar interactions they had witnessed but ignored. Thaddeus's name was spoken not with resentment, but with reluctant respect. He had done what internal reviews had failed to do for years. He had made the system look inward. 2 weeks after the morning that changed everything, Thaddeus Monroe walked once more through the front doors of the same precinct that had briefly mistaken him for a threat. This time, he wore no handcuffs, no tension in his shoulders, and no need to announce who he was. Everyone already knew. The atmosphere inside was different, not just quieter, but more alert, more aware. Officers straightened when they saw him, not from fear, but out of recognition that the man who now walked these halls was helping reshape them. Captain Huxley met him at the entrance to the conference room, holding a tablet with updated policy drafts. "We've incorporated the oversight protocols from your office's federal model," she said, voice clipped but respectful. "Bias response training is scheduled for the end of the month, and we've launched the whistleblower protection program you requested. We've also started reviewing historical case logs for patterns of discrimination." Thaddeus nodded once, taking the tablet and scrolling through the data. The reform wasn't complete, it was barely beginning, but the gears were turning, and for the first time in years, they weren't spinning in place. Inside the room, several community leaders sat around the table. Faith leaders, nonprofit heads, teachers, and local business owners, each invited by Thaddeus to participate in the Reform Advisory Board. This wasn't going to be a top-down correction. It had to include those most affected by the system's failures. Chief Laramie entered a moment later, less guarded than before, and offered Thaddeus a short nod of acknowledgement. "We've reviewed the 37 complaints tied to Deputy Bland's activity over the last 5 years," she said. 16 were marked as unfounded, without full investigation. "That stops now." "It should never have started," Thaddeus replied evenly, then gestured toward the board at the front of the room, where a slide deck titled "Restoring Trust, Rebuilding Culture" was displayed. As the meeting began, Thaddeus didn't lecture. He listened. He wrote. He asked questions that made people pause. Questions like, what would it take for someone who fears this department to one day work here? Or what does safety look like when everyone actually feels it? The responses were honest, raw, and sometimes painful, but every word was fuel for change. There were still officers who resisted. Some grumbled about policy overload. Others bristled at the scrutiny. But those voices were losing their grip as the culture began to shift. And for the first time, accountability wasn't seen as punishment. It was seen as responsibility. Outside the precinct, news crews still hovered, but the headlines had started to evolve. What began as federal official wrongfully detained by local cop had grown into federal reform spark department overhaul, and city launches first civilian-led police reform board. Thaddeus refused interviews. He wasn't interested in sound bites. His focus remained on the long game, on building a structure that could outlive his presence, one resilient enough to withstand whatever came after. Garrett Blaine, now awaiting formal federal deposition, had moved out of state. His case had become a textbook example in law enforcement workshops on implicit bias and procedural misconduct. The uniform he once wore now hung in a closet collecting dust, while the memory of that morning, of the calm man on the bench, still looped in his mind with a slow-burning sting of regret. But Thaddeus hadn't pursued retribution. He had pursued change. That distinction was felt by everyone involved. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about prevention. In the months that followed, the park where it all began saw new benches installed, each with plaques honoring figures of justice, both local and national. One bench, the one beneath the rusted lamppost, now bore a simple inscription: "Dignity does not ask permission." Thaddeus visited it occasionally, still reading meditations, still sipping green tea from a worn thermos, but now with a faint nod from passers-by who recognized him not as a symbol, but as a citizen who had stood firm when it mattered most. The precinct continued its transformation, slow, imperfect, but genuine. complaints decreased, community trust began to inch upward, and the civilian board started to take real influence over policies and hiring practices. It wasn't utopia, but it was progress. The kind that sticks. The kind that grows roots. And through it all, Thaddeus never stopped showing up. He attended every meeting. He answered every difficult question. He held people accountable, including himself. Not because he wanted power, but because he understood the power of presence, of staying in the room when others leave, of insisting that change is not just possible, but necessary. The end. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more narratives that challenge the system and spotlight real change. What part of the story resonated with you the most? Was it Thaddeus' calm resolve, the moment of truth at the precinct, or the shift in the department's culture? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from and how you felt as the story unfolded.